Today we're going to be talking about producing high health crops free of pests and diseases. There's quite a lot in this topic and we'll delve in some areas a bit deeper than others. But first of all, can people just raise their hand, make sure that they can hear me okay? Don't want to keep on going if you can't hear me. Excellent, got some hands. Thanks very much. Okay, we'll get started on producing high health crops. So the overview of this topic, we'll touch briefly on the levy funded projects under which this webinar is funded, and we'll just describe what is a high health plant. Sometimes that's obvious, but maybe there are some aspects that aren't so obvious, and then we'll get into some of the other parts of the webinar in more detail. Really, part 3 is the biggest. Okay, so this nursery project is a 5-year project, started last year, runs for another 3 years after this year. We are doing a lot of different types of things. The diagnostic component is quite large. All production nurseries receive 6 free samples every year through Grow Help. If you could just raise your hand if you sent through a sample to Grow Help, that'd be great. Yep, I see there are a few people that have. Hopefully you've had a good experience. And this is something that everyone, all production, and we'll talk about that a little bit more through the webinar. We are updating, creating new fact sheets. These become available on the GIA newsletter and website. This website, if you haven't been there already, is very valuable. There is a lot of technical information. The last aspect of this project, which is reasonably large, is that we are running experiments investigating the effect of nursery hygiene on pest and disease incidents. So moving on to the next section. Firstly, what qualities do you include in what you would call a high health plant? Now, I think that most of these would be fairly obvious, but maybe there are more. Raise your hand. Can you think of other qualities? And yes, I do have some locked and loaded that may not be quite as obvious. So some of these more challenging qualities, not just to have a vigorously growing plant, but enough fertilizer in there to keep it going for a while. Now, obviously, to purpose for the plant that you are producing. A plant that's not just free of diseases, which are the symptoms of a pathogen infection, but free of pathogens as well. Not just free of insect and mite damage, but free of the pests, that mites and insects. No weeds growing in the pot. Great, but how about no weed seeds, no propagules present so that they won't pop up when they get to your clients. Good root health, but also no J-root, no pot-bound plants, ideally. Not just survive, but survive and thrive. So this webinar, what we'll be doing is talking about some of these key aspects to cover these somewhat, sometimes at least, challenging qualities. Obviously, we can't do everything in 1 hour. So we're covering the key points and we'll point you in the direction of further resources as needed. Does anyone have any questions at this point?
Andrew, we do have one,
Yep.
which I think is a pretty important one. How is it that production nurseries send in samples, yet I assume some nurseries have not heard of this at all? So is it more of a communication issue, letting all nurseries know that this
Yes,
is available to them?
We do our best to communicate these free services through the national nursery communication channels, as well as the state-based organizations. So if you aren't part of, being subscribed and reading the e-newsletter from GIA, that was a slip, and you don't access information from your state, then you may well miss out. We've done our best to reach everyone, and sometimes it's just, there's only so much we can do.
Well, hopefully that's helped answer that question for Rihanna.
All right, so we'll keep on going because this next section is quite big, and I've got a small illustration here. So firstly, to produce high health plants, we need to understand what those plants require to grow optimally. So high health plants are those plants that are grown under optimal conditions, and of course every plant has different conditions that lead to its best possible growth, whether that's their irrigation requirements, light, fertilizer, so on and so forth. Poor conditions, poor growth is likely to occur if few of those requirements are met. If you have few enough, you lead to stressed plants, poor growth, more likely to lead to pathogen infection, damage that will lead to an unsaleable plant. Where you have more and more of the right qualities, when you maybe have a subset of those conditions that the plant enjoys to have optimal growth, you get good growth. Where you have optimal growth, where you have basically everything, you can lead to the most optimal growth. And optimal growing conditions provide the best chance to produce a high health plant. In reality, having perfect conditions for a plant, that's pretty challenging, but we can strive to do this more and more, and that's part of really what this webinar is about. Firstly, a couple of myth busters that I did kind of enjoy putting together. We get these sorts of comments from time to time, and sometimes they do make us scratch our heads. So some people have expressed that growing plants with pathogens in the nursery produces plants that are better suited to withstand natural environments, because the natural environment has pathogens. Well, every best management growing guide always starts with healthy plants, free of pests, free of pathogens. No one wants to start with plants that are infested because they do worse. Beyond that, it is now legislated in many states. There is a general biosecurity duty of care or obligation to produce and spread effectively plants that are healthy. And there potentially could be repercussions of spreading plants that have diseases or pests, particularly if you are knowingly selling them and they had perhaps an exotic plant pest. This would be bad news. I wouldn't want to be in that position. Similarly, with regards to nutrition, grow plants with less than optimal fertilizer so that they're more resilient when they're planted out. Okay.
That's the one.
Optimal nutrition optimizes plant physiological processes. I'm going to leave it at that. This one we hear not that infrequently. Personal favorite. I've been growing this plant for 20 years and nothing's changed, except that the plants now have symptoms of decline, leaf spots, fruit rot, death, so on and so forth. The conclusion is that something has changed, even if you aren't aware that that change has occurred. So keeping an open mind, important. Just trying to move to the next slide. Here we are. Okay, so managing your nursery inputs optimally is the best way to produce high health plants. There is a lot in this section, and I will move through it as quickly as I can, particularly since we've had that small delay. We will talk about some of these key areas in some detail and point you in the direction of further resources. One of which is a webinar we made a couple of years ago on preventing diseases. Very similar to producing high health plants, but there are some different aspects to it, and so we are going to have a complimentary webinar, and you may get some value out of that webinar in the future. So propagative material. So all of your incoming stock, your seed, your mother stock. If you've got problems in your propagative material, you're going to propagate problematic plants. Sounds really obvious, but sometimes people see their mother stock plants, or they think, oh, maybe it will be okay. Well, often that's not the case. Devote more effort to your higher risk lines. Those plants where you have problems, you've got to be on the ball all of the time, or things are more likely to become a problem. Your incoming stock. Inspect your stock. Who inspects all of their incoming stock on a regular basis? Just raise your hand if you do. Quarantine that stock. Yes, I'm seeing some raised hands. That's great. Quarantine that stock. Keep it separate from the nursery proper, if you possibly can. And the length of time that you do that will depend on your exact situation and the host plant, the types of pests or pathogens or problems that you're trying to reduce coming into your nursery. Yeah, build good relationships with your suppliers and return stock as needed. Submit plants for testing. Even if you think you know what's wrong with it, send it off. We get growers sending plants to us going, I think that this is problem X, Y, Z, but I really just want a confirmation. That's awesome. Happy to help you guys in that sense. Just going to try and move to the slide. One moment. Here we are. Seed. In a similar way that you can inspect your plants, you can inspect your seed. You can look for lesions on the outside of the seed coat. Sometimes you have to take off the seed coat and you can look for lesions there too. Use a microscope as required. And you can assess viability in a number of different ways, whether that's through germination tests. I might just get, do we have a show of hands of people that propagate from seed? Viability tests, yes, we have a few, great. Where you can cut open the seed and look for whether or not that seed is filled. And the same, the float test, you put it in water with some detergent. Seeds that aren't filled float. Now, any seed that isn't filled, obviously, it is not viable. Some seeds can be filled but still not be viable, but it helps to reduce some of the problems and to understand, well, are these seeds going to be viable? If possible, heat treat seeds. Can we have a show of hands? Who heat treats their seeds themselves? And as there's more equipment available of a high scientific grade of availability. That's what I'm trying to say is you can get equipment to heat treat seeds to quite a specific heat and maintain that heat. So if you are looking into that, great, it is potentially available to you. Okay, mother stock plants are of course critical, and anybody who's been to one of my workshops before will probably have heard me say to treat their mother stock like gold. Only propagate from healthy plants. Sometimes that's easier said than done. If you have large mother stock plants, you may have problems towards the base of the plant that are not easy to detect. Just going to stop. I thought I heard a cut out. Can people hear me still? You raise your hand, please. Yes, I've got one,
Yep.
two.
Okay. You, Andrew. Yep.
Great. So it must have just been some noise. I'll keep going. If possible, the best practice, excuse me, is to grow your mother stock separately from your production stock, so that if you get a problem in your production area, it doesn't move to your mother stock. Renew your mother stock periodically, and ideally grow in a container, not in ground. And we'll talk about in-ground stock shortly. Only take cuttings when plants are dry. If you take cuttings that are wet, you're more likely to get fungal spores germinating and entering the cut region of the plant. Plus, rainwater, irrigation water can bring spores down the stem. So if you take the cuttings when they're dry and then disinfest them, you're going to reduce the rate at which you have pathogens enter that cutting. Water management is also critical. Only use clean water. It is with some dismay when I hear nurseries having problems. They're using water from dams that hasn't been disinfected in any way, shape, or form. I find it counterintuitive. Use clean water. Reduce organic matter buildup in your tanks. Clean your tanks as required. And if you are getting unusual buildup in your tanks at a high rate, then think about ways of reducing that intake. Rainwater is sort of clean, but when it's collected from a roof, there is a risk that pathogens can be present. So it's not truly clean because organic matter, fungal propagules, weed seeds, they can be on the roof too, and then they can flow into your tank. So best practice from a pathology perspective is to disinfest that water. Irrigate the minimum possible, don't overwater. Monitor your pH and EC. Who monitors pH and EC of their water and potentially growing media too? Just raise your hand, please. This is a very simple way of doing it, and there are tools available. Yes, I see one raised hand. There are tools available, monitoring systems that can be put in place to do this practically in real time. Or you can have devices that go into a pot and they'll Bluetooth to your device as you walk by, and all then you have to do is walk by it, look at that data. Technology is available, and you can make use of it. So poor water quality can lead to abnormal growth, similar to that caused by herbicides. We get some queries around water where people will get poor growth and they've got a chlorine disinfestation unit, but there are some questions about whether or not it's working properly. And oftentimes we hear that they are only measuring free chlorine. From time to time, it may well be worthwhile to also measure combined or total chlorine. So there is some differences. Free chlorine is the amount of chlorine available that is in a form able to sanitize, whereas combined chlorine is bound to other compounds that doesn't really sanitize. And of course, your total is the sum of the free and combined chlorine. Some chlorine compounds can cause phytotoxicities and have been linked to growth similar to those previous two slides that we just. This one particularly was linked to poor quality water, and we don't know exactly what caused it, what compound, but it was definitely in the water. So by testing more than one of your free chlorine and your total chlorine, you can work out, well, are there compounds in there that might be causing poor growth? Growing media, of course, extraordinarily important. And there are a lot of different qualities, properties of growing media that are better suited to certain types of plant growth. I'm only going to touch on this briefly. For one, it's not an area of expertise, although I do know things like this, where if you have low airfield porosity, you're more likely to have hypoxia, anoxia, so low oxygen or no oxygen environments that will lead to root death, even if it's not infected with a pathogen. And we see this in samples that are sent to us on a fairly regular basis. Be aware of the different traits and your purpose in growing the plants, whether it's tube stock or advanced stock. You need to have different growing media. It isn't a one-size-fits-all, and that's the main message with growing media. You need to grow high health, optimal plants. A media needs to be chosen that will best suit those plants. So in some sense, there are no wrong growing medias, though there are some we don't recommend. The message is that you have to use those medias within a framework that suits that media. Now, we don't recommend use of sand, particularly from rivers, as it can be infested with a variety of different pathogens. And the same way, peat can also be infested if it's not treated correctly. And obviously, always exclude soil and other organic matter that's not intentionally included. And that's part of the reason why why we recommend covering your media or having it in stored in certain ways. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Does everybody understand the differences between composted media, pasteurized and sterilized media? Can you raise your hand if you're really familiar with these terms? Yeah, I have only one or two coming up. I'll go through it. So composted media has spent 3 days at least at 55 degrees, and this removes most pathogens but does not kill the beneficial organisms as much. Pasteurized media stays at 80 degrees, at least 80 degrees for 30 minutes, and it destroys most organisms. Whereas sterilized media, 100 degrees, 30 minutes, and it basically kills everything, including your wheat seed. Be aware that this can change the growing media properties, and it can be valuable to start with a clean slate. However, the more devoid it is of life, the more important it is to add beneficial organisms to fill it and assist your plants to grow. So things like your trichodermas and your bacillus. And there is research out there from New South Wales with DPI where they had seen better growth where they had more of these microorganisms present. So store your media appropriately, cover it if at all possible. This can help keep it free of organic matter. Never have it in contact with the soil or degrading timbers. Degrading timbers they rot, fungi are in there, and that can potentially get into your media. Likewise, growing media that is constantly wet is more likely to have contaminant fungi. And we've had quite a few inquiries from the eastern states of growing media that is becoming an area where fungi are growing. So just if you raise your hand if you've seen this in your nursery where there's just seemingly random fungi or mushrooms or other such, not necessarily plant pathogens, but contaminant fungi. And this can be negative for plant growth because the fungi changes the properties of the media and may make it hydrophobic. There may be some phytotoxicities that occur from products that those fungi produce. I did see a few hands go up, so thank you. So you want to avoid that situation where possible. Most people understand wind can bring pests and diseases with wind dispersed rain, and really the ways that can be used to mitigate those are protected cropping structures, even keeping doors closed, even if they aren't insect exclusion areas. Closing doors can assist in reducing the numbers of pests coming into that structure. And monitoring plant health, it's very important for detecting problems early, and we'll talk about that more soon. Management of growing areas is a massive area that is critical for producing high health plants. So keeping things clean is the key message. If you keep your growing areas clean, you're more likely to produce clean stock. If you manage your weeds proactively, you remove dead and declining plants. Find out what's caused decline when it has occurred. Don't just rely on your intuition, because sooner or later you're going to be wrong. Dispose of your plants hygienically. And when you're disposing plants that you have even a slightest suspicion might be infected with a pathogen, we recommend disposing of them off-site, or certainly outside of any water catchment. We hear people sometimes tell us that they've disposed of their Phytophthora infected plants at the top of their site. And I ask them, okay, so tell me that the water that you're collecting isn't recycled. Oh yeah, it's recycled. Okay, well tell me that it's not downstream of your disposal site. Oh no, it is. But we disinfect with chlorine. Well, that's great. But you're increasing your risk. High inoculum loads stress your disinfestation systems, and you're more likely to then spread it to other stock. So don't hold over old stock, sell it or get rid of it when it's too old, when it's not a saleable and optimal plant. Removing it from the growing area will reduce the risk of having a problem occur and then spread to your other stock plants. And of course, disinfest your growing areas when it's clear. Get it free of organic matter. Put a disinfectant down to try and break the life cycle of anything that might be present. Okay, this point here, make sure plants do not come in contact with soil. This sounds obvious. Soil has many things that may be present in it. However, your equipment, your vehicles you might be using to move around, they may come in contact with soil, and your plants may become in contact with them. So it's important to clean your equipment from time to time, as it can be quite easy to contaminate nursery stock with soil. If you are does anybody grow plants in ground? Just if you could raise your hand, that would be great. Because growing plants in ground can be risky. Certainly more likely to have a pathogen be present. I did see at least one hand go up, thank you. And once that soil is infested with a soil-borne pathogen, you basically have to assume that it's always going to be there. So take great care and manage those areas with care that they deserve, because it's very easy to then lose those areas with a pathogen being in there. There are a lot of nursery hygiene practices that we haven't talked about, and they are present in other resources. And I'm just going to highlight this website again. Can you raise your hand, please, if you have never seen or been to this website? There's at least one. Thank you for your honesty. There is a huge amount of there are a huge number of resources available to you through the nursery production industry. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Australia has one of the best, if not the best, in the world for resources and tools available to its growers. And these are just a couple of the places that you can access these. There are fact sheets on lots of different pests and diseases, management plans that lay out details of different cultural practices to specifically manage those problems. So tie into those, and we'll actually talk about this again later on. So that was a big section. Do we have any questions at this point, John?
Well, none that come through from the growers, but I have a couple myself actually, because I'm learning as I'm going along. Well, with your old stock, getting rid of it, can you actually compost it? And if you can, how effective is that? So rather than just binning it, putting it in the dump or whatever, put it in a compost heap, and that way you can reuse it at a later stage. That's as part of your potting media.
Yep, it's a good question. I mean, I guess it depends on how hard lines you want to get. If there's any risk that that plant has a pest or pathogen present, then there is a risk that it would go into your compost pile. Certainly, I wouldn't be reusing growing media. So it would be more about composting and then using it in a soil garden, I guess.
Yep.
That is actually probably more of a question that I'd probably handball to, people that have more knowledge in that soil health than I do.
Because I guess if you actually sterilize your media, you could still compost it. Then, if it was composted properly, add it to your media and then sterilize it. Therefore, you wouldn't have run that risk. I'm just thinking of ways of reusing things rather than, throwing them out.
Yes, but I wouldn't recommend reusing growing media. The properties of that growing media, they run out and they won't work optimally anymore when they are reused in that way. So maybe they would be able to be reused in a garden situation, which in a different system, but I certainly wouldn't in a nursery system.
Yeah, we did get one comment from a grower saying just dump it.
Yeah, and so if there are industry allied tradesmen that have more knowledge in that area, type it in and we can relay that back later in the webinar.
Yeah, no,
okay, I'm conscious of time.
Yep, go for it.
So I'll keep on going. Okay, so how do you know when your plant's no longer high health? You know, it sounds like a really obvious question, and anybody who has been to a workshop or a webinar of mine, you probably have heard me talk about monitoring of plant health. It's essential, and there are lots of different ways to monitor for plant health, and what I want to talk a little about is passive versus active monitoring. So your passive monitoring occurs while you're completing other activities by hopefully all of your staff. That is certainly what we'd encourage. Passive monitoring for all staff. And this might be when you're weeding, when you're moving stock around, when you're picking stock. The more eyes that are out there looking at plant health, assessing plant health, and reporting that plant health back to the correct people, the better. However, there is also what we call active monitoring, which occurs specifically to ascertain the health of plants. This is when you go out and you are actively looking for problems to ensure that your plants are healthy. And this is the gold standard. Both are valuable. And I don't want to discount passive monitoring, the value of passive monitoring. However, it is also very important to have active monitoring, because if you rely on passive monitoring and only do passive monitoring, you will have problems. If there are people that have an experience where they have moved from passive to active monitoring and they're happy to share it, please type it in and we can relay that back to the group at the next break. Active monitoring involves inspection of each batch of plants for abnormal growth. And we're not just talking pests and diseases. anything that's unusual. So whether it's leaf spots, leaf deformity, dieback, stem damage, vascular disorders, root rots, or something that just looks odd, they're not growing right, they lack vigor. Each set of those symptoms can have many different causes, and you need to look at them carefully and inspect them with a magnifier and investigate further to try and to ascertain what that problem is. Send it off for testing. Get it confirmed. You will become fluent, so to speak, in recognizing your common problems. But it's important to not become the word eluding me. Don't become complacent. If you see that damage that looks like aphid damage, check. Make sure that you see aphids, because sometimes there are things that produce aphid-like damage that are actually worse than aphids. And the management that you might use for aphids won't work for those other problems. This is the power of active monitoring. Even if all plants appear healthy, active monitoring, go and inspect the leaves and stems with a magnifier of a subset of those plants. Not everything, you can't possibly do that. But particularly assign greater monitoring effort to those high risk or high value crops, and monitor root health as appropriate on a regular basis so that it becomes part of your normal practice, and then you will detect problems more regularly. It's important to become familiar with what is healthy and what is unhealthy. So sometimes we get samples like this where they send in an unhealthy plant and a healthy plant, and I've put that in inverted commas because we have these same two plants to the right, and on this unhealthy plant, as it was called, it's pretty obvious there is a root rot. On the right, you sort of can see, well, there is a little bit, but this rot was actually very difficult to detect when you just pulled it out of the pot. When you look at it more details, you can see there is some root tip necrosis. There are some larger roots dying back. Sometimes we get samples and all we see are these little tiny fine hair roots dying back. That may or may not be the cause because by a pathogen. Having that root necrosis is a sign that some part of your system isn't working right. And sometimes those fine hair roots dying back are enough to cause a nutrient deficiency symptom above the ground. So this is what I'm talking about. It's well and good to say, how do you know when your plants are no longer high health? But getting into that fine hair detail, if you don't mind the pun, can be more difficult than it would seem at face value. Similarly, with your vascular problems, I mean, who cuts open, if you've got a wilting plant, who opens up the crown or the stem vascular tissue to detect what that vascular tissue looks like? So anyone, if you raise your hand, please. Because everyone comes across a plant that wilts from time to time, even if it is only from an irrigation problem. Thank you, yes, one raised hand. But it's important then to inspect, okay, well, do I have a bigger problem? Is there evidence of a vascular wilt pathogen, or was it really like I suspected, and was it just the irrigation? And these are just some of the ways that plants may look when starting to rot. Some plants, the vascular tissue is not just green. Sometimes they can be naturally, healthily, a little bit more orange. And plants' vascular tissue oxidize and become brown over time, similar to the way apples oxidize when you bite into them. So it's important to become familiar with what's healthy and what's unhealthy so that you can recognize when your plants are no longer high health. I'm trying to move to the next slide, just one moment. Here we go. So when you encounter a problem, I know I've said this a couple times, but I think there are several thousand, I'm not sure how many thousand, production nurseries across Australia. We get samples from only a small fraction of them. So I'd just like to encourage again, take advantage of the service. We're here, it's a levy-funded project. It's important for industry to have problems identified. All right. And as we said before, create a routine for plant monitoring. Schedule it in to your day-to-day activities. The exact method may differ according to the nursery size, number of staff, the staff skills, but you can create a culture of reporting problems the correct way, system for reporting problems, and having those communication channels work so that you can efficiently identify where a problem has occurred, write that down, and make changes to your system to improve it, which does lead into the next section in a moment where we're talking about improving your systems. Record your data electronically. Does anybody do this? Does anybody record their data electronically, whether it's in a spreadsheet or however they do it in a database? Raise your hand, that'd be great. Yes, at least 1, 2, wonderful, that's great. But we've got like 2 of 25 or so. Needless to say, I kind of think that we can do better than that. When you have it recorded electronically, it's searchable. You can build patterns of risk. Hard copies, they get lost. Relying on your memory, we all know how good that really is. And we have an industry that is building these systems for you. You don't have to remake the wheel, so to speak. For all NIASA nurseries, you have access to the auto management system, which is a system to record all of these sorts of problems, plant protection records, biosecurity records, many other different types of records. It's an exciting system, and I'm really looking forward to this system taking off and strengthening nurseries to manage plant health efficiently. Does anybody use that auto management system? One. If you have any comments that you'd like to put out there, positive comments about how it's helped you, please feel free, and we can relay that to the group. Okay, any questions at this point?
Nothing has come up, Andrew. I think you seem to be covering all the topics quite well.
And given the time.
Yes, and the fact that we had that slight hiccup.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, we'll keep on going. This next section isn't too long, and it's working at that continual improvement. So one method of continually improving growing practices is to have small-scale experiments to make adjustments to those growing practices. Who already does this? Who has little experiments in their growing areas from time to time or on a regular basis? 1, 2, 4, 5, excellent. Okay. In my opinion, the best growers are the ones that are doing this most regularly. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time. So if you're already doing it, you're ahead of the game. That's great. Hopefully, you'll also be able to get a couple of points on how these types of experiments can be done. Because you can do them to test different types of growing media, different fertilizers, whether there's a phytotoxicity that's occurred in your crop, to test new plant lines. And there are some pitfalls in these experiments. So this experiment here, this is just a little one on the right, where the grower had a problem with water quality. These plants here on the left are noticeably smaller. You can't see their roots, but you'll have to trust me that they were much smaller and they had signs of necrosis, root rot, even though there was no pathogen present. And we linked it back to the water because these plants here that are noticeably larger and become larger and larger and healthier were grown from mains water. So the key point here is to have a good point of comparison. You have to have, if you only do one thing and you change, you've previously been growing the plants with one growing media or one fertilizer, and then you start growing all of your plants with another growing media or another fertilizer, whatever, it's not a good point of comparison. You need to grow both systems at the same time. Similarly, sometimes we have inquiries where people send in some weirdo symptoms and we go, well, that looks like a pesticide phytotoxicity. Get some healthy plants, treat it with the product that you just used, or a couple of certain plants with certain products, depending on how many products have been used and in that period of time. Work out, disentangle what's caused that phytotoxicity. And sometimes we get great results where they've been able to produce the same symptoms in a small number of plants and go, okay, well, we can't use that product on those plants. It's really simple, and hopefully most of you have already done this sort of thing already. So you want to run your trials with enough plants to give you some confidence that the result is consistent. If you just do it on one plant or two plants, yeah, you may not have enough of a consistent result to show a difference. So you need to do it with a few plants. And you may want to repeat it in different seasons, or even in the same season, but maybe over in different growing areas, on different plant species. And you can do this to gain some understanding of what's better, what's worse. Perhaps it's not a plant growth, but perhaps you're reducing the amount of time it takes to get from stage A to stage B. These sorts of things can be used then to justify to maybe an owner or other production managers that a widespread change is justified. Though I would make sure if you're in a situation where you have governing management, I would recommend keeping them on board and informed of your experimentation. It's really important to do this sort of thing with information that you receive from sales reps. Sales reps will often promote certain products. The sales reps that I respect the most are those ones that work with you, that go, okay, let's put my product on these plants and let's leave those plants untreated and just see how well it works. Those people, those businesses are to be commended. Where you get people saying, oh no, do everything. Do your whole nursery, it's going to work great. You have no point of comparison. You don't know whether it's worked or it hasn't worked because you don't have your untreated plants as a point of comparison. So build a culture of improving plant production in that way, in creating systems to monitor your plant health as we talked about previously, because there is always room for improvement. It doesn't matter how good your nursery is, there is always room for improvement. And another way that you can do this, and we are nearly at the end of the webinar, is to build management plans specifically for your business. And you need to prioritize those problems or those challenges that are greatest for your business, and you can devote more time to those issues. There are resources available, as I said before. If whiteflies are your main problem, there is a whitefly management plan. You can take those key messages out of that. This will work for me. This will work for me. That one, not so sure about. I'm going to put that one on the back burner and maybe try these other things first. Write down what's working. Write down what's not working. Keep a record of it. Keep a record of how you are managing your plants, because then, if and when a new production manager comes onto the scene, you can have a more seamless transition. Any questions? At this point, we are basically at the end. Oh,
We have a couple, Andrew. There's one about optimum temperature for propagation. I assume that was, is there an optimum temperature in propagation? And I imagine it would depend a lot on the plants that you're trying to grow.
sorry, I just had an announcement. Hopefully you guys didn't have that too. Oh, one moment. John, can you keep on talking?
Yep. Yeah, and the other question was about pasteurizing your potting media. One grower here that was recommended to use 60 degrees C at 30 minutes and not 80. Has things changed in that respect?
Okay.
I've always been under the impression it was 60 for 30 minutes, but
okay.
have things
maybe
changed that?
Perhaps the information, the research that I had viewed wasn't. I'd have to check that, to be honest.
Okay.
And because I'm not, I'll go by the consensus. It isn't. I mean, I didn't make it up, but perhaps the information I got wasn't right.
Yeah, because I was under the impression it was 60 to 65 for 30 minutes, but unless things have changed over the years, I'm not sure. But yeah, the other one was about optimum temperatures for propagation.
That will come down to what plants are you growing, what requirements are needed for your plants to grow optimally. I don't think there is a one size fits all, but happy to hear from experienced people in that area.
Yep. But yeah, they're the only two that's come through. I've tried to address them, but yeah, thought I'd just throw them out there to you as well. So
yeah, for sure. And sorry that we had the fire alarm, the evacuation thing just before went on mute.
This presentation is really hot, Andrew.
Yeah, apparently. All right. Well, in that case, if you have any further questions, you can shoot us an email. We will get back to you as soon as you can. We're going to make this webinar available on the GIA YouTube channel. And we'll also be sending out a survey, hopefully tomorrow or this afternoon, to all of the registrants